In 1552, 2,000 ordinary Hungarian civilians, shopkeepers, farmers, and housewives faced down 40,000 of the Ottoman Empire's most elite warriors. What happened next would shatter the myth of Ottoman invincibility and prove that sometimes the human spirit is the ultimate weapon of war. Think about those numbers for a moment. That's one defender for every 20 attackers. The Ottoman Empire had conquered 3 continents. Their janissaries were considered the finest soldiers on earth. Their siege cannons had never failed to breach a castle wall. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. It wasn't professional soldiers who stopped them. It was bakers who turned their ovens into weapons, mothers who chose to fight rather than flee, children who became the difference between victory and annihilation. You're about to witness how ordinary people achieved what professional armies couldn't, stopping the unstoppable Ottoman war machine dead in its tracks. You'll discover the secret weapon that turned household items into instruments of war. You'll understand why the Ottomans' own elite troops became their greatest weakness. And you'll see the moment when children, yes, children, tipped the scales of one of history's most lopsided battles. If Eger fell, Vienna was next. Christian Europe hung in the balance. The defenders knew this. They also knew that surrender meant slavery for their children and death for themselves. So they made a choice that would echo through centuries. This wasn't luck. This wasn't divine intervention. This was something far more powerful. The moment when an empire discovered that mathematics don't account for one thing: desperation. To understand how shopkeepers defeated an empire, we need to see the world through their eyes on that September morning. The year 1552 found Hungary bleeding. For decades, the kingdom had been torn between 2 expanding empires, the Austrian Habsburgs to the west and the Ottoman Empire to the east. Like a wishbone pulled from both ends, Hungary was fracturing. In the fortress town of Eger, Captain István Dobo watched the horizon with growing dread. At 32, he'd already seen more war than most men see in a lifetime. But this was different. His wife touched his shoulder. "The rumors?" she asked. He nodded. "Not rumors anymore. They're coming." The Ottoman Empire in 1552 was at its apex. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, they controlled lands from Baghdad to Budapest, from Cairo to the Crimea. Their military machine had perfected siege warfare into an art form. In the past 50 years, they had never lost a major siege. Not once. The Ottomans had a saying, "Where the Sultan's cannons speak, walls listen." And they were right. Their massive siege artillery could reduce stone fortifications to rubble. Their Janissary Corps, Christian boys taken as children and transformed into elite Muslim warriors, were the special forces of their era. Their supply system could sustain armies of 100,000 men for months. Eger Castle stood like a lonely sentinel guarding the road to Upper Hungary, and beyond that, Austria. If Eger fell, the path to Vienna lay open. The castle itself was modest, its walls were aging, its garrison tiny. Dobo had exactly 300 professional soldiers. The rest of his 2,000 defenders? Refugees who'd fled the Ottoman advance, farmers whose lands had been burned, merchants whose trade routes had been severed, women and children with nowhere else to run. Among these civilians were 2 people who would prove crucial. Eva Sisi, a merchant's wife who'd organized the women into work brigades, maintaining supplies and caring for wounded. And Gergely Bornemissa, a minor noble with a talent for engineering and a dangerous fascination with gunpowder. "God gave us fire," he once told Dobo. "I'm just improving his design." As September dawned, Dobo gathered his unlikely army. Professional soldiers stood next to farmers still learning to hold spears. Housewives practiced loading crossbows. Children as young as 8 were organized into ammunition-running teams. The captain's orders were simple: "We hold here, or Hungary holds nowhere." But why did 40,000 Ottoman warriors march on this remote Hungarian castle? The Ottoman force that approached Eger in September 1552 was a masterpiece of military organization. At its heart marched 15,000 janissaries, the legendary slave soldiers who'd never lost a siege. These weren't ordinary troops. Taken as boys through the Devshirme system, They were raised from childhood for one purpose: perfect warfare. They didn't marry, they didn't own property. They lived only to fight and win for the Sultan. Behind them rolled 16 massive siege cannons, each weighing 3 tons. The largest could hurl 150-pound stone balls that would punch through 6 feet of solid wall. The artillery train alone required 500 oxen to move. Ottoman military engineers had calculated exactly how many shots were needed to create a practical breach: 300 cannonballs per section of wall. The supply train stretched for miles, 2,000 camels carrying enough powder, shot, and provisions to maintain a siege through winter if necessary. The Ottomans had learned from centuries of siege warfare. Wars were won by logistics as much as courage. Leading this host were Ahmed Pasha and Ali Pasha, 2 commanders who despised each other but were united in confidence. They'd taken dozens of fortresses together. Eger, with its aged walls and civilian defenders, would be routine. Inside Eger, Dobo faced reality with 300 professional soldiers, mostly light cavalry and infantry, who'd survived previous Ottoman encounters. They knew what was coming. But the other 1,700 defenders were civilians who'd been training for mere weeks. The women, led by Eva Sese, had organized into specialized units. Some would manage the boiling oil and water stations, kitchen warfare scaled up to military dimensions. Others would serve as battlefield medics and ammunition carriers. "Your kitchens are now armories," Sisi told them during training. The women practiced in shifts, learning to pour boiling liquids from the walls without burning themselves, timing their movements between enemy arrow volleys. Gurgly Bornamisa worked feverishly in the castle's makeshift workshop. He'd been experimenting with something new: wheels packed with gunpowder and metal fragments that could be rolled down into attacking formations. The design was simple but untested. "If it works," he told his assistants, "we turn their numbers against them. If it doesn't," he didn't finish the sentence. The castle's defences were modest. Its walls, built in the 14th century, were designed for an earlier age of warfare. Against modern Ottoman cannons, stone was merely an inconvenience, not a barrier. The garrison had 40 small cannons, toys compared to Ottoman siege guns. Their gunpowder supplies would last perhaps 2 weeks of heavy fighting. But Eger had hidden strengths. The castle sat on a rocky hill, making mining operations difficult. Its water supply was internal, a deep well that couldn't be poisoned or cut off. And the approach routes were narrow, preventing the Ottomans from bringing their full numerical advantage to bear at once. On September 9th, Ottoman scouts appeared on the horizon. By September 11th, the entire army had arrived. The defenders watched from the walls as 40,000 men made camp, their tents spreading across the valley like a canvas city. The sound of their preparation, wheels creaking, officers shouting, the ring of hammers on metal, carried clearly to the castle. That night, the Ottoman heralds approached under a flag of truce. Their message was simple: surrender now, and you may leave with your lives. Resist, and watch your families die. Dobo's response was equally simple: come and take us. On September 11th, the earth itself announced their arrival. Dawn on September 11th began with thunder, not from the sky but from Ottoman cannons. The first barrage announced their presence with devastating authority. 16 siege guns fired in sequence, their 3-ton frames lurching backward with each shot. The stones of Eger trembled. On the walls, civilians who'd never experienced bombardment learned what true fear meant. Each cannonball impact sent stone fragments flying like deadly hail. Dust clouds rose like phantoms, coating everything in grey powder. By noon, 50 balls had struck the eastern wall. The mathematical certainty of destruction had begun. But Dobo had prepared his people for this. "Stone breaks," he'd told them. "We bend." The defenders adapted quickly. Women and children formed bucket brigades, not for water but for earth and timber, to shore up damaged sections. When cannons fired, spotters shouted warnings. Defenders learned to read the rhythm: load, aim, fire, impact. In those precious seconds between shots, they moved. Days 4 through 7 brought the first probing attacks. Ottoman irregulars, expendable troops used to test defences, approached with scaling ladders. Here, the civilians had their first taste of combat. A farmer named Joseph, who'd been practicing with a crossbow for only 3 weeks, made the first kill. His hands shook so badly afterward that his wife had to help him reload. But then something unexpected happened. The women, led by Eva Sisi, appeared on the walls with cauldrons of boiling water mixed with quicklime. As Ottoman troops reached the top of their ladders, the women stepped forward. The screams that followed echoed across both armies. Warriors who'd faced death in a dozen campaigns fled from housewives armed with kitchen implements. Bornemissza used these early attacks to test his innovations. His first experimental bomb, a clay pot filled with gunpowder and metal scraps, proved devastating when dropped on clustered enemies. But his real breakthrough came by accident. A wooden wheel, set alight and packed with explosives, broke free from its mounting and rolled down the hill into Ottoman ranks. The random path of the burning wheel caused more panic than any aimed weapon. By day 8, the pattern was clear. Days meant bombardment, a steady rhythm of destruction that had opened visible cracks in Eger's walls. By day 14, over 3,000 cannonballs had struck the castle. Defenders counted them, using the Ottomans' own ammunition to reinforce damaged sections. But nights brought a different war. Ottoman miners, working by torchlight, began tunneling toward the walls. The defenders could hear them, picks striking stone in the darkness below. Dobo assigned his best listeners, including several musicians with trained ears, to track the underground approach. Countermining began immediately. Hungarian diggers, led by mining engineers from the nearby mountains, dug their own tunnels to intercept. What followed were the war's strangest battles, knife fights 30 feet underground, men killing each other in spaces so tight they could barely swing their arms. Bornemissza experimented with smoking out enemy tunnels, with flooding them, and finally with explosive charges that collapsed them entirely. The first 2 weeks established a brutal rhythm. By day, bombardment and assault. By night, the underground war. Between desperate repairs, tending wounded, and the constant work of survival, the civilians were transforming. Fear remained, but routine created its own courage. Women who'd fainted at the first cannon fire now worked through bombardments. Children learned to sleep despite the thunder. On September 25th, the Ottomans attempted their first major assault. 5,000 troops attacked simultaneously from 3 directions. For 6 hours, the walls swarmed with ladders, grappling hooks, and climbing men. Civilians fought alongside soldiers, using anything that could kill: rocks, boiling oil, improvised spears. When one section nearly fell, Dobo himself led the countercharge, his family sword cutting through Ottoman elite troops. The assault failed, but everyone knew it was just a probe, a test of defences before the real attack. Ottoman engineers had identified weak points. Their miners reported progress. Artillery had created promising cracks in the eastern wall. In the Ottoman camp, confidence remained high. They'd lost perhaps 500 men, acceptable casualties for reconnaissance, in force. The defenders looked exhausted. Their walls were crumbling, their ammunition running low. Ali Pasha told his officers, "Another week of bombardment, then we take it." But on September 29th, everything changed. The real battle was about to begin. September 29th dawned blood red. The Ottoman War Council had decided, today, Eger would fall. Ahmed Pasha ordered 15,000 troops to attack simultaneously. No more probes, no more tests. This was the killing blow. The assault began at first light with a bombardment that dwarfed all previous efforts. Every Ottoman cannon fired continuously. The eastern wall, already weakened, began to crumble. By noon, a breach opened, 15 feet wide, rubble-strewn, but passable. The nightmare scenario had arrived. "The wall is down." The cry echoed through the castle. Defenders rushed to the breach, knowing this was where they would live or die. Dobo positioned his best troops at the gap, but there weren't enough. That's when Eva Sisi led her women's battalion forward, carrying their cauldrons of boiling oil mixed with sulfur. The first Ottoman wave hit the breach like a steel tide. Janissaries, the elite of the elite, surged forward. They expected to face demoralized soldiers. Instead, they met housewives who poured liquid fire from above. The oil clung to armor and skin alike. Men who'd never screamed in battle screamed now. Behind the women, children worked with desperate efficiency. 8-year-olds carried stones. 10-year-olds ran ammunition. A boy named Peter, just 12, would later be remembered for maintaining arrow supply to 3 different positions while Ottoman fire fell around him. But then came Bornemissa's moment. He'd prepared for this, the breach defense. As Janissaries packed into the gap, he gave the signal. His assistants lit the fuses on his newest creation, wooden wheels packed with gunpowder, metal fragments, and pitch. They rolled these burning wheels down wooden ramps directly into the breach. The first wheel exploded among packed Ottoman troops. The second followed, then a third. The wheels' random bouncing paths made them impossible to avoid. Flames spread through tightly packed ranks. The breach became a death trap. But the Ottomans were professionals. They pulled back, regrouped, attacked again, and again. For 6 hours, the breach saw continuous fighting. Bodies piled so high, they formed a new barrier. Defenders used enemy corpses as shields. Below ground, a parallel battle raged. Ottoman miners had finally broken through, entering the castle's lower chambers. Hungarian counterminers met them in darkness. The underground war became a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Men fought with knives, picks, bare hands. The tunnels were too narrow for swords, too dark for accuracy. Bornemissa had prepared for this too. He'd placed explosive charges at key points, ready to collapse tunnels if needed. When Ottoman troops began pouring through one breach, he gave the order. The explosion shook the entire castle. The tunnel collapsed, trapping dozens on both sides. Some were enemies, some were his own men. War made no distinctions. But collapsing that tunnel forced the underground fighters to the surface. Now the castle had 2 crisis points: the wall breach and enemies emerging from below. Dobo, already wounded in the leg from an arrow, commanded from the courtyard, sending reinforcements wherever the line wavered. October arrived with no respite. The Ottomans committed their reserves, fresh Janissary units, men who'd conquered Belgrade, who'd taken Rhodes, climbed the walls. Hand-to-hand combat raged along the battlements. Defenders pushed ladders away, only to see 2 more take their place. A Janissary commander named Mustafa led a group that actually gained the wall. For 10 minutes, Ottoman banners flew above Eger. Then came one of the battle's strangest moments. The women of Eger, having exhausted their oil, attacked with farm implements, scythes meant for grain-harvested soldiers. Pitchforks found gaps in armor. Ava Sisi herself, burns covering her arms from oil splashes, led the charge that retook the wall. In his command tent, Ali Pasha watched through his telescope with growing disbelief. His elite troops, men who'd never failed, were being pushed back by civilians. Worse, he could see the doubt spreading through his ranks. Soldiers who should have pressed forward hesitated. The impossible was happening. October 5th brought the ammunition crisis. The Ottomans, despite their massive supply train, were running low on cannonballs. Weeks of bombardment had exhausted even their careful preparations. Inside Eger, the situation was worse. Gunpowder supplies were nearly gone. Arrows were being pulled from the dead to fire again. Defenders improvised desperately. When gunpowder ran out, they threw stones. When stones ran low, they threw anything: furniture, cooking pots, even shoes. One defender later wrote, "We threw our possessions at them, then threw parts of the castle itself." But then came the third reversal. Bornemissa, searching the castle's deepest cellars for anything useful, discovered a hidden cache, barrels of gunpowder, forgotten from decades past. Not much, but enough for one more surprise. October 13th would be the final test. Ahmed Pasha, furious at the delay, ordered an all-out assault. 25,000 men would attack. No reserves, no rotation. Everyone forward until the castle fell. The assault began before dawn. Wave after wave struck the walls. Ladders rose like forests. The breach filled with attackers. Every defender was on the walls: soldiers, civilians, women, children. A 14-year-old girl named Zofia would later be remembered for maintaining position with a crossbow after both her parents fell. The Ottomans gained the breach. They gained sections of the wall. Victory seemed moments away. Then Bornemissza unveiled his final creation. Using the last gunpowder, he'd built what he called fire wheels, larger than before, designed not just to explode but to spray burning pitch in all directions. The first fire wheel rolled into the Ottoman ranks at the breach, then another, and another. The packed troops had nowhere to flee. Fire spread through their ranks. Panic followed. Men pushed backward, trampling their comrades. At that crucial moment, Dobo led a final charge. Wounded, exhausted, he raised his sword and shouted words that would echo through Hungarian history. "For your children, for Hungary, forward." Every defender followed. Soldiers, civilians, women, children, all surged forward in one desperate push. The Ottomans at the breach, already shaken by the fire wheels, broke. The panic spread. Elite janissaries, men who'd never retreated, ran. From the Ottoman command post, Ali Pasha watched his army dissolve. Units that should have pressed forward pulled back. Officers couldn't restore order. The impossible had happened. 40,000 had been stopped by 2,000. As the sun set on October 13th, something impossible happened. In the Ottoman command tent that night, the atmosphere was poisonous. Ahmed Pasha and Ali Pasha faced each other across the map table, their bitter rivalry finally exploding. "Your cannons failed," Ahmed snarled. 16 siege guns, and the walls still stand. "Your janissaries fled from women," Ali shot back. "The finest soldiers in the empire running from housewives." The truth was worse than either admitted. The casualty report lay between them: 10,000 Ottoman dead, a quarter of their force gone, including many elite troops. Disease had begun spreading through the camps. Dysentery from the autumn rains, infected wounds festering in crowded conditions. But the psychological damage was worse. Word spread through the camps. Eger was cursed. The defenders weren't human. They were devils who threw fire and fought after death. Janissaries who'd never known fear whispered about burning wheels that chased men uphill, about women who fought harder than warriors, about children who laughed while killing. That night, Ottoman scouts reported something else. Hungarian relief forces were finally approaching. Not many, perhaps 3,000 men, but fresh troops against an exhausted, demoralized army. The war council lasted until dawn. Some commanders wanted to continue, but the mathematics had changed. They'd lost too many men, too much ammunition, too much faith. At 2 a.m. on October 18th, the order went out: pack the camps. They would withdraw. In Eger Castle, exhausted defenders noticed the cannon fire had stopped. Dawn brought an impossible sight. The Ottoman camps were emptying. Tents coming down, wagons loading, the great army preparing to leave. "Is it a trick?" defenders asked. Dobo sent scouts. They returned with incredible news. The Ottomans were truly retreating. The impossible had happened. David had not just faced Goliath. David had won. The victory speech Dobo gave was short. He could barely stand, wounds seeping through bandages. "We held," he said simply. "Hungary holds." But counting the cost sobered any celebration. Of 2,000 defenders, 700 were dead. Barely a family had escaped loss. The civilian casualties were horrific. Farmers who'd become soldiers, mothers who'd become warriors, children who'd become heroes, all paid in blood. The wounded overwhelmed what medical knowledge existed. Women who'd fought on the walls now fought to save lives. Ava Sisi, her own burns wrapped in cloth, organized the care. More civilians than soldiers filled the makeshift hospitals. Their injuries told the story: burns from oil, cuts from close combat, crush wounds from falling stones. The castle itself was a ruin. Walls showed gaps like missing teeth. The eastern tower had partially collapsed. 38 days of bombardment had left scars everywhere. Winter was coming, and they had few supplies, fewer buildings intact. But Europe's reaction was electric. News spread like wildfire. A minor castle had stopped the Ottoman tide. Not with professional armies or foreign allies, but with ordinary people fighting for their homes. In Vienna, church bells rang. In Rome, the Pope declared a day of celebration. The Holy Roman Emperor sent a letter that would be preserved in Hungarian archives. All Christendom owes a debt to Eger's defenders. They have shown that faith and courage weigh more than numbers. From the Ottoman side, the defeat sparked soul-searching. Official records minimized the loss, but private letters told the truth. One Janissary officer wrote, "We were not defeated by soldiers but by a nation. Every person in that castle fought like their soul depended on it, because it did." The immediate strategic impact was clear. The Ottoman advance into Upper Hungary stopped. Vienna was safe, for now. More importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility had cracked. If 2,000 civilians could stop 40,000 elite troops, what else was possible? But perhaps the most profound impact was on warfare itself. Military theorists across Europe studied Eger, trying to understand how civilians had achieved the impossible. The answer unsettled them. When people fight for their families, their homes, their very existence, traditional military calculations become meaningless. As winter closed in, Eger's survivors began rebuilding. They had won more than a battle. They had proven something eternal. Empires can conquer territories, but they cannot conquer the human spirit. Not when that spirit has something worth fighting for. But the battle's end was just the beginning of a legend that would reshape history. The siege of Eger sent shockwaves across Europe that reshaped military thinking for generations. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, had been halted by farmers and housewives. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Strategically, Eger bought Hungary precious time. The Ottoman expansion westward stalled, giving the Habsburg Empire years to strengthen its defences. Vienna, which might have fallen in 1553, instead stood firm when the Ottomans finally arrived in 1683. Those extra decades made all the difference. The defeat forced Ottoman military reform. They realized their traditional siege tactics, overwhelming firepower and elite infantry, could fail against determined civilian defenders. Future Ottoman campaigns would emphasize rapid movement and avoiding prolonged sieges where possible. The empire that had perfected siege warfare began to fear it. But Eger's greatest impact was cultural. It proved that ordinary people could alter history's course. Across Europe, the siege became required study in military academies, not for its tactics, but for its lesson about human will. The idea that civilians could be effective defenders revolutionized fortress design. New fortifications included positions specifically for civilian auxiliaries. The role of women at Eger shattered conventions. Eva, Sisi, and her battalion proved that warfare wasn't exclusively male domain. While it would take centuries for formal recognition, Eger planted seeds that would eventually bloom into accepted female military participation. For Hungary, Eger became a national touchstone. In centuries of foreign domination, Ottoman, then Austrian, then Soviet, the siege reminded Hungarians what they could accomplish, united. The castle became a pilgrimage site, its broken walls more powerful than any intact fortress. The siege's lessons resonate today. Modern military theorists studying asymmetric warfare often cite Eger. When conventional force meets unconventional determination, calculations change. Afghanistan, Vietnam, countless conflicts show Eger's truth. Motivated defenders fighting for home possess advantages that pure military power cannot overcome. The psychological principle remains unchanged. The Ottomans came to conquer a castle. They found something far more dangerous, a community that chose death over surrender. Not from fanaticism, but from love, for their families, their neighbors, their way of life. Bornemisser's innovations, improvised weapons using available materials, presaged modern guerrilla warfare. His firewheels were primitive, but the concept of turning enemy advantages into weaknesses would echo through military history. Perhaps most powerfully, Eger demonstrated that heroism isn't reserved for professionals. Joseph the farmer, Eva the merchant's wife, young Peter carrying ammunition, they proved that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can achieve the impossible. Returning to our opening paradox, 2,000 ordinary Hungarians stopped 40,000 elite Ottoman warriors. Now you understand how. Not through superior weapons or brilliant tactics, but through something more fundamental. The Ottoman Empire assumed people would choose survival over freedom. They calculated that civilians would break under professional military pressure. They were wrong. At Eger, the defenders chose neither survival nor freedom. They chose each other, and in that choice, they found both victory and immortality. Empires rise and fall. Castles crumble to dust. But the lesson of Eger endures. When ordinary people stand together for what they love, they become extraordinary. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change the world.